All right, I have hit record.
Well, friends, it is my privilege to introduce my brother, Dr. Eli Wheat. Um, he and I have had some incredible conversations over the years, and not only share the deep bonds of family and brotherhood, but also have just asked each other deep questions and sat around campfires. And it's a piece of that I want to share with you this morning, that quest and that exploration, and particularly how that quest has unfolded with respect to being trans. So I want to open with a question that goes this way. As a cisgendered man, I've taken my gender identity for granted. It's been remarkably valuable for me to be in conversation with you, Eli, as you've become more self-aware, because I've had to become awake about the ways in which my relationship to gender is constructed and performed, rather than kind of inherent, like I might have thought. And so I'm curious about what you could share with us about forging an identity that is outside of the expected construction and performance of gender.
Well, it's such a complicated question for me because it's a really complicated process, this whole transgender thing. And I wanted to maybe by way of answering this question, I can tell a tiny bit of my story or how I got here, because I don't feel like I identify as a transgender person. Like, I identify as a farmer and an ecologist, and I've always been a boy. I feel like that's probably not a surprise to anybody. Like, I mean, nobody's necessarily known that I'm a boy, but like, if I say I'm a boy, like, it's a really easy thing, I imagine, Harold, for you to see that I have always been a boy. Like,
It is.
and I feel like I didn't, I think, as a young person, when my hair was not gray, and,
What?
I would always get just mistaken for a boy. I just was a boy often. And it was a wonderful thing. I liked that a lot. It wasn't really until I started to get a little older and people more often saw my gray hair first, and they stopped mistaking me for a boy, that I started realizing, like, how much I liked when I was mistaken for a boy, how often that actually happened. And at about that same time, we got a new president at our university, and she is just an incredibly fearless leader and advocating strongly for justice and to extend the privilege of the university beyond their traditional ways that oppresses communities of color and marginalized people. And as a Latina woman who is herself queer, she has just done amazing things within the social construct of what the university is. Almost immediately upon her arrival to the presidency, after she followed this like much more conservative president, she got some funds together and utilized those funds across campus to place in strategic locations gender neutral bathrooms across the campus where there really hadn't been before. And there was a significant amount of funding to, like, renovate old structures. I know you all at your church know what the costs of those kinds of things are for aging infrastructure. Simultaneously, she took the Indigenous community on our campus and made that community, the Office of Minority Affairs, something that reports directly to the president. No direct line of communication. Like, I want to hear from you. You are a priority to me. And then at that same time, there was just a sort of shifting and softening. The university started to do more trainings on diversity and equity and leadership, and all of the student staff services, so people who work directly with students, were encouraged to attend these trainings and to do things like make explicit welcome in the way the Methodist Church can make explicit welcome as a reconciling congregation to traditionally marginalized queer folk in the church life. So our student services people started to make explicit welcome to minority and oppressed students across the campus in different ways. And one of the ways they started doing that was they all started putting their pronouns at the bottom of their email. That was an official act that was supported, not demanded, but supported by the university and became a generally acknowledged best practice. A lot of the student services folks and other people that interact with undergraduates who I deeply admire were doing that. And so I went in my office one night, and this was probably about 5 years ago, and I sat down and I was like, I'm going to put on my email signature my pronouns because that is the cool thing to do. Right. And I sat down in my own office, in my own space, in front of my own computer, all by myself. And I put down, these pronouns that have traditionally been associated with the body that I was born with. And I couldn't do it. Like I literally couldn't do it. I sat there and I was unable to make my fingers do the thing. And it was like kind of a big deal. And shortly thereafter, I was finding myself not once, but more frequently in student circles where it's like, okay, we're standing around, there's 15 or 20 students. And the question that the person in charge of the circle is asking is, tell us your name, what department you're from, and what pronouns you prefer. And like, it felt like this real difficult moment for me because I don't identify as a transgender person. I do identify as a boy in the body of a girl. And like, nobody ever asked me my pronouns. So that was a pretty radical invitation. And nobody else in that circle, importantly, had any skin in the game. They could all say their pronouns as if it didn't matter to them, as if it was part of their birthright to know their pronoun and to feel that they belong to it. And that is a beautiful thing. I can't imagine what that might feel like, but that is not my experience. And so I was sitting in these circles, right, with these students who I am, in love with my students. I love my students. They're the most inspiring group of people in the whole world. The best and brightest minds of the students in my state come to the University of Washington. And that's an incredible privilege. And so here I am in these circles where I feel like either I'm going to lie to a bunch of people I love, or I'm going to tell the truth. And like, that's going to just cause a really big problem for me because it's a truth that I haven't reconciled with myself. And I haven't reconciled with it, in part, because I'm not that brave. It requires so much bravery. And even though this has been a really hard process for me as a white person in a supportive community, it has still been really hard. And like, I can't imagine. And there is so much space, around gender for women, so much more space. And I think that's the other thing that, if you look at the statistics of people that transgender, there aren't a lot of transgender people in the world. I think it's like something that's hard to put a number on, but 1%, 2%. But within that 1 or 2%, predominantly the people that transition are men. And that's because the space that our society affords men is so much more narrow. And I wouldn't have known that, before I was living in the body and the space of a woman and becoming more in the body and the space of a man. But I could talk a little bit about how narrow it is to be a man and why that sucks and why men need feminism, why men need trans men, because there's a different space that we have. And that space can be a liberating space. And that's a really important piece of the transgender experience, both for women and for men. My experience is that as a woman, so much is possible. You can wear pants or a skirt, but it's actually not that possible to be a cisgendered man and just wear a skirt. Like, that's kind of a big deal. It's a real intentional thing that a person would have to do. They'd have to be really brave to do that. But as a person, in a female body, I can wear a dress or not wear a dress now, and nobody is going to look twice. And that's just a very small example. I can walk up to a child in the body of a woman, and I can look at that child. I can smile at that child. I could maybe, like, if the child approached me, like, I could put my hand out and touch that child, and nobody would think twice about that. And as a man, if you even look at a kid wrong, the world looks at you like you're doing something that's aggressive. And I mean, we could go into that whole space, but like touch, casual touch, really changes for men. Like in my experience of being a man, casual touch, it just doesn't happen. And as in my experience as a woman, casual touch happens way too often. So I think that's something too. I got off track. I'm sorry, Harold. Did I answer the question?
You totally did. Yeah. I was so curious about the difference between, thinking about it as a cisgendered person. I mean, I didn't have to think about it. It just felt inherent. But I think the gift for me is seeing that the whole thing is constructed and performed, and related to some inherent traits, but the gender itself is very much socially defined. And that's such a gift for me over the years talking with you.
Yeah, and it's been a gift for me, and in some ways it's been a spacious gift. In other ways it's felt like a challenging road, because because gender is such an important concept in our society, and since it is a performance, as a trans person, you don't ever exactly know if you're performing it correctly to your own intentions. Like, I might have an intention of how I would like to perform gender, but I might just mess it up all the time because, like, I'm just going to use my hands, and that using my hands is something that I do because I learned to do that in my female body, but it's not really something that natal men in our society do a lot. And if
Except
you,
preachers.
except for preachers, maybe preachers do, but even like, they probably do it less, male preachers than female preachers. And anyway, I think that there are just so many ways in which it is a performance, and it's a performance that you both practice and you've never practiced, right? Like, so it's like there's a lack of clear direction, where the instruction manual is very nonverbal.
One of the things that I have really admired about you is that you have consistently pursued the truth of who you are. And I'm curious about how you know what is true. Like, and I'm curious from the perspective of a pastor, like one of the deeply intimate pursuits of life in faith is the constant pursuit of God's will. Thy will be done, et cetera, et cetera. But the constant question is, how do you know? And there's something very deep within us that gets to that self-knowledge that we have to develop on the journey, a sensitivity to truth at a deep way. And I'm curious about the tools that you've used to discern, as you've come along this journey to discern truth. What is true for you? And if they might be useful to those in the faith community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that, I feel like truth is a complicated word, because I wouldn't say that before I was clear about my gender identity in a more public way. I have also been really clear about my gender identity. I just haven't really thought of that through the lens of being trans, right? So like, I do remember that, like, one time, maybe 8 years ago, I was teaching, and the students asked me something, and I was like, yeah, well, I mean, my gender identity, it's like I identify as a 12-year-old boy, and so when I like fast forward 8 years, and this TA who I had been working with is now someone who's a colleague at the university. And I mentioned to them that I was going to start this process of transitioning. And they were like, oh, yeah, of course. Like, I've known you're a boy for a really long time. Like, you didn't know that? And but I didn't know it. Right. And so, like, what is truth
Yeah.
is such a really like complicated thing. Like, you can say your truth and you can hear, you know, God calling and you can respond to it. And also, God can keep calling, and that length of time of the response can be um, there. There can be long distances between the experience of saying one's truth and the experience of feeling one's truth, or the
Oh,
experience of
yeah.
hearing God's call and the experience of knowing God's call. And in between those times, you might already be responding to God's call without actually knowing. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
I,
Yeah.
I think that, there are some things that have been really valuable to me in this process. And, I know I'm talking to my brother who's a pastor, but, prayer isn't one of them. Prayer, it isn't that I don't feel that I am a prayerful person. It's just that right now, for queer people in general, the church can be a complicated home. I think we can come back to that, but we come from the wheat children. We all come from a really strong faith background, and that is a really important tool. And one of the tools that faith background has given me that has been immensely useful is the tool of silence. And
Mm.
I don't know always the difference between silence and prayerful silence, but I have been pursuing prayerful silence, and that feels really different to me than prayer in the way that we learned prayer as children. Um, but it doesn't feel less valuable. And in that space, I feel like sitting silently in real silence where my brain is silent and what I'm listening for is a deeper space within myself, and sometimes people think of that as a body space. And maybe it's just an embodied space where the breath of who we are is in having an opportunity to intersect with the living breath of the world. And I feel like that's been a really valuable tool. I've started practicing yoga. I light a candle. It's crazy. I run a lot. Um,
I
and
love that we have both independently started practicing yoga.
yeah, yeah. And yoga is just phenomenal. And, I think I also have like, a very strong and wonderful community of friends and folks who are around, who support me, and with whom like I can share my writing and reflecting. And I have a very good therapist who I can talk to and who helps me think about finding my own truth through my body and really like allowing my body to feel and be. And I think that gender, for all people, bodies bodies both define and constrain one's gender, right? And so the body can be like a really liberating space for one's expression of gender, which is maybe more of a cisgendered experience, right? Where your body like helps you live your gender. A transgender experience, one's body has actually been between one and living in a, in a coherent fashion with one's identity. And yet, like, I don't want my body to not feel like a home for me. And so what does it mean to find home in one's body? Um, and that's a really deep kind of work, and I'm trying to do that work. It keeps me up a lot at night as I learn my own body. And I think, one of the really interesting intersections for me is the work that I do as a faculty member is that I teach about sustainability. And if we were to think about broadly, like if we step back and think about universities in general, and we were to think about all the bad things that have happened to our planet, right? Like the deforestation, the rampant rise of the highway system, the, you know, destruction of rivers, all that stuff happened because people got educated at university. Like that wasn't like the uneducated citizenry going out and polluting rivers and building highways and, you know, destroying ecosystems and creating new chemicals that, you know, cause holes in the ozone. We think about like those people are people that were educated at university that led those advances. And I think that one of the things behind that is like this sometimes human inability to sit in silence and handle the discomfort of coming home to oneself and to find enough in the space of oneself. And so we pursue with ardent passion our careers and we sacrifice a lot for that.
Mm.
And that is an illusion too. And, you know, so I think that when I think about sustainability, it actually becomes like one of the most important tools that I can give my students is silence, right? It's not doing. And that's where the exploration of self, you know, we're all transgender people. It's just that, you know, 99% of us are stuck in a binary context.
Mm. I think one of the more interesting conversations I had with one of um, my friends who is coming from a gay male perspective, and he looked at me and he said, you know, you live a queer lifestyle. You are celibate. I'd never thought of myself as identifying as queer before, but it was a really wonderful thought experiment to think, well, wait a minute, this is really different and odd in many ways. Um,
I don't want what my statement was a strong statement. I don't want to undermine the struggle that non-binary people have, that transgender people have, that um, people who do not identify at all with the construct of gender. I just think that for people who grow up in a cisgender space, there's a great invitation to deconstruct that and to own the pieces of it that work for you and to step back and deeply consider those pieces that don't and how you can be part of amplifying more spacious relationships, you know, for your friends and colleagues, because that's what that's what the invitation of a transgender experience is.
that has been one of the deepest gifts for me about our conversations over the years. It's just me thinking more deeply about, well, what does it mean for me to be male, and why am I acting that way, or why am I thinking that way about what it means to be male? Yeah. Well, so besides investing in the effort, and church, it's important that we do invest in the effort to get pronouns right. Um, what, do you have any insights for us, Eli, about what the church could do to support and welcome the trans community more fully?
Well, I feel like, when just very beginning of this process, um, I'm an active member of the Langley United Methodist Church here in my town. And in the first, I sort of started this process about, I guess it was almost 2.5 years ago. And like there were a few steps. Like the first step was like I got to talk to my wife because like that's a big deal. And we can talk about that. That's a whole separate conversation. But then I got to talk to my daughter, and I got to talk to the people I live with because this is really important. Like I need them to support what I'm doing. I talked to this therapist that I had sought out because I knew that I was ready to do this work. And I said, you know what, like the real reason I'm here is about this. And that was probably about like our second time visiting with each other. And so that was very useful. And then I went from her office down the road to our Methodist church, and I just knocked on my pastor's door, and I was like, Pastor Mary, like, did you have a second to talk?
Yeah.
And so, I sat down with Pastor Mary, and I was like, just kind of working that through. And like, here's what I'm thinking about, like, I kind of want to do this, like, this is important. Like, I feel like one of the things that has been the hardest for me in the journey of being a transgender person is kind of messing with my body in order to be seen. So, like, I had top surgery, which in the transgender community for female to male transition means I had a double mastectomy. Um, and that was like something I did because I felt like my my breasts were standing between me and the world seeing me as male. And that is really, really hard because like also that body, like that's part of my body. Like God gave me that body. And that's a big part of the teaching that I feel like um we have like in our church, right? Like the body is our temple, and like we should be taking care of it. And so it was hard at first for me to, and I really needed Mary's help in kind of working through how I would work through that in the context of my faith. So I think one thing is having trans competent pastors who can talk about this stuff, from a faith-based capacity, who don't feel afraid to enter into this conversation. Like, okay, yeah, like I can go there with you. Like we'll talk about that. And that was really helpful. And then I would say the other thing that Mary did that was like probably the best thing was so I went and had this conversation with her the next Sunday. So this was like whatever, Tuesday, Sunday. It's like we're talking about 5 days later. The single that we have one bathroom across from the pastor's office. It's just like a bathroom. There's a regular sink and a toilet and a door. And the sign on that bathroom had been changed to all genders welcome, like overnight. Like that didn't go through committee. That was just like someone doing the right thing and everyone recognizing that it was the right thing. And like you think, that meant a lot. The overnight, the church secretary like changed everything that was coming out, like the name of, my name on the, like I had a new name tag. Like it was like, this is what Eli's doing. And like, it was really important. And like, remember the first time, I wore a tie to church and walking across, it was like Easter Sunday. And, I felt really awkward. And like one of the old white men in our church came across, like he left the church. He walked down the front stairs. He crossed the church, the street in front of the church, met us and walked into church with us. Like, and I was walking in with my family, but that was such a gift because it felt hard to enter the church in that way, to make that transition with this faith community. And I think, that's not an institutional thing, right? That's the kind of radical welcome that Christ is asking us to do, to walk in someone else's shoes and imagine what that's like and be there with them in the moment when they most need you, to be able to cultivate your sense of empathy. But that's a real, I mean, those are some really big gifts that our church did pretty radically right away. And actually, none of those are about pronouns. People trip up about pronouns, and everyone, as we go on this journey, like each person we interact with has their own journey with us to a place of comfort and spaciousness, right? And I think that a lot of grace is really important in that process, recognizing that, you know, as a person who is crossing between gender, that's a boundary crossing space. It's a challenging space, but everyone else who's witnessing that is also part of that crossing. And that, like, I feel like for me, like I try to hold a lot of grace around that, you know, name and pronoun space. Like, because another way I think about that is that I didn't start transitioning until I was like 43. And like, so that means for 43 years, people got my pronouns wrong. Like, what the heck? Of course, now at least some of the time they're getting them right. And that's pretty neat. Like, that feels really good. So, I think, tripping up around a pronoun is like a tiny little thing. It's not even like it's important. It's really important. But, when you imagine the iceberg of what this process is, it's a small piece. And don't, I mean, I do have one final thing, which is that, you know, when you do mess up about a pronoun, is you're gonna do that. Don't make it about you. Make it about how how that hurts the other person. And I think that that's something that really bothers me. Like when someone messes up about their pronoun, about my pronoun, and then they trip over themselves trying to make themselves feel better, when actually the person who is hurt is me, and they actually aren't seeing that, they aren't caring about that. And that really matters.
Eli, I am so grateful that we had this conversation. And I'm so grateful that we get to share it. Um, is there anything else you'd like to leave with us?
Um, no, uh, no, I'm really glad your church is doing this work, and really grateful for the leadership that this church, that you all in Binghamton have undertaken, for a long time. I grew up in New York State, and so I know the role that this church has played historically in supporting queer folk in a place that is powerfully not welcoming. And so I want to thank all the members of this congregation for that incredible leadership. And, I think it's so cool that my brother gets to work with you all as a pastor and serve this historic congregation, because you all have done really great work.
Amen.
Thanks for having me, Harold.
You betcha. Oh my gosh. Oh.